Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Gilead Gleanings podcast with video elements. It's probably a term for that. I don't know what it is. I don't really care to know what it is. Someone just told me that Merriam-Webster decided that irregardless is a word.
I'm so upset about that.
I knew there'd be some strong reactions in this group.
Regardless of the reactions, let's carry on, Damon.
Yeah. This group, by the way, is a group of folks. So at First Presbyterian Church, we've encouraged and invited people to read over the course of the summer Gilead. It's a novel. And so this is a group of folks that we've put together to sort of host a little conversation about Gilead, talk about the characters, some of the themes, ponder on connections to our own lives, our own world, our own little speck of dust, and so we're going to do that. This is the second one of these, and I believe we're scheduled to do a third one in a couple of weeks as well. So, but for now, I'm going to invite us to reintroduce ourselves. I'm Damon. I'm the associate pastor at First Presbyterian Church. Anne, would you like to go next?
Yes, I'm Anne, and I am a retired English professor from Hastings College.
And Constance?
I'm Constance, and same for me.
And Jenny?
I'm Jenny Welsh, and I am still teaching, but I have been part-time teaching for the last 10 years. Since having kids, I have stayed at home, and so I teach as an adjunct for CCC and Bellevue in Omaha.
Very nice. And Greg?
I'm Greg, but I think for the sake of this book study, I will refer to myself as Botan or Botan or Boughton or Bofton, because there's a parallel here that we need to note before we start, Damon. This is about John Ames, who's a congregational pastor, which you are a congregational pastor, and his best buddy, Boughton, Bofton, is a Presbyterian pastor, which, of course, so from here on out, I would like to be referred to as that. No.
I mean, we can do that. We're
pronounce your name, though.
Happy to make those sorts of changes and adjust as we go along. So now I refrained there, Boughton. I'll have you note from adding in. He's oftentimes referred to as poor old Boughton.
I appreciate your subtle refraining there. John Ames, Damon, Hyman.
So yeah, we're continuing on in Gilead. We'll probably talk about a lot of sort of general things about the book, and maybe kind of more specifically some sort of things in kind of the pages 80 to 1, kind of the middle third of the book, I guess, and go from there. So let's just start with a general sorts of questions. Anything that sort of jumped out to you, caught your attention as you continue to read?
Okay, well, I guess I have a question that Greg's remarks just made me think of, and that is, at the time when this novel is set and the time when he's narrating, how different would congregational and Presbyterian churches and theology have been? I mean, was this a big deal for the two of them to be friends, I guess, is part of what I'm asking.
I'm not an expert in this area, but know enough about the history of the two churches and the two church movements. Both of them draw from the same theological pool, if you will. And so similar to Damon being a UCC pastor serving a Presbyterian church, this would not have been unusual for a Presbyterian and a Congregationalist pastor to be friends. You'll notice throughout the novel he refers to the Baptists, and there would be a much larger divide there between a Baptists and the Congregationalists or Presbyterians. But even at the time this novel was set, the Congregationalists and Presbyterians were getting along pretty well. Both did the westward expansion about the same time and were planning churches. You'll see different patterns of the presence of congregational churches and Presbyterian churches in Iowa and Nebraska and Kansas, but there would have been good relationships between the two, both naming sort of Calvin as the father of their theological underpinnings. Congregationalists claim a Reformed theology. They add a few additional theologians in there, but the sessions they had doing Hebrew and Greek on Reverend Ames' porch. Damon and I have those same sessions every week with our Hebrew, and no, we don't. But we do bounce ideas off of each other, similar to how they would. So yeah, I feel a good, like a pretty accurate representation of what that would have been, and some simpatico with the way that Damon and I work together today.
Yeah, thank you.
There seems also to be a pretty friendly relationship with the Congregationalist Church and the Methodist Church in the novel.
Yep, and some slight theological differences there, but the theological differences would not have, in the same way that there's slight theological differences between us and First United Methodist, those don't keep us from being able to do mission together and being able to be the church together, and that would have been the same there too. I would imagine. I don't know, Damon, any perspective on, as a kid who grew up in a small congregational church in Iowa?
No, not really. I was thinking about as sort of the churches expanded westward and the denominations expanded westward. There were, and Greg, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there were agreements between denominations oftentimes in terms of how close that they would attempt to settle churches to one another. And so if one denomination got to town X, then the other denomination would skip over it and go to town, whatever the next letter in the alphabet is. But why? It's Y. That sort of thing. But you mentioned, Constance, the appreciation of the Methodist Church. If I'm remembering, part of that has to do with Grandpa Ames is off running around doing abolitionist things and has come back from the Civil War, and his congregation is really kind of devastated by the Civil War, and it's mostly just widows that are a part of it. And during the service, he'll open up the windows and let them listen to the singing that's coming from the Methodists, which sort of just struck me as this sort of appreciation of vibrancy.
Yeah.
I guess.
Uh-huh. And so is it because Grandpa has encouraged his congregation to go to war that his is devastated and the Methodists are not?
It's a good question. The Methodists didn't have a really strong anti-war beat to them any more so than other Christian churches would have. They weren't Mennonites or Quakers or anything like that. The Methodists did historically have a slightly more social justice perspective. The Methodists were more involved in the abolitionist movement.
Okay.
And so that could have something to do with it.
Okay.
I guess my sense of it was, as much as anything else, Grandpa Ames just wasn't around, and
Right.
and hadn't been tending to his church. He'd go off during the week and he'd roll back in on the horse in time for worship on Sunday. Yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
Well, part of what you're talking about is, I marked it because it was one of the things, again, talking about water, which we talked about last time, because they were talking about the Methodists holding service outdoors by the river, sort of playing off the beauty of the water and whatnot. But in looking back at that, it's really speaking to what you all are talking about the new people and the young people were returning to the Methodists who were holding outdoor meetings. But then it says he, which is referring to the grandfather, he respected the Methodists because they had borne a great part of the burden of the war. So, that they had played their part. So I don't know if it was just like his absenteeism, or they also talk a lot about how the building is so run down. That's the same time, right? And so the building itself is so in need of care and attention. I don't know if that's what drew people away from it, and they decided to go somewhere else where there was new growth and new building on the horizon. But that's also the mention of the women and what they do to try to keep that building going, but in what bad shape it really is.
Yeah, they plant flowers around it, but it's pretty much in shambles. Is that the church that has had a fire?
Is that the one struck by lightning, or that's different?
No, that's I think the Baptist church gets struck by lightning. I'm thinking like the conversation is is reminding me also of just the relationship also between Grandpa Ames and his son. There's part in there that the son talks about something to the effect of essentially that his dad wasn't there to be a dad to him.
Right.
And I think that gets reflected in the condition of the church building itself.
Yeah.
It makes sense that current John Ames, it's really hard to know how to refer to them.
It is tough.
Letter writer John Ames might in a way be hung up on that, because that's going back to his motivation for writing, is that he knows he will not be there for his son as he grows. And so this reflection back on fathers and sons and their relationships is something that's weighing very heavily on him, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
And the church building that the narrator is currently preaching in also continues to be in a state of disrepair.
Yeah, that's one of those witty comments he makes about, like, he makes some sort of flip comments about meeting with the trustees and about how he just thinks they're sort of like just being polite, like, they're really just appeasing me, but they're just gonna tear it down when I'm gone.
Yeah, waiting for him to die, and then they're going to tear down a church building. I thought that was an interesting and if we're going to tie the building and the relationship between the grandfather and the father and the father and the son, I think that there probably are some parallels there to be drawn, and he himself towards the end of his life is that church building that people are just waiting to be torn down, and he's trying to preserve his legacy in some way by writing this letter to his son, right?
Right.
Yeah, and that building, they've all preached in that building. Do I have the correct understanding on that?
I think you're right. I think the grandfather started pastoring that church, and then his father, and then the letter writer, John Ames, all pastored, like 3 generations of that family. The grandfather went off and pastored in Kansas at the end of his life and all that stuff, but I think all 3 of them had ministry at that particular church in Gilead, Iowa, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that building is really one of the things that really connects all 3 of those generations. Yeah. And I like when you talked about pointing out to the trustees that there's a rooster on top of there's a weather vane on top of it, and then once they were aware of it, he figured they were probably going to take it down.
Is that a thing? Is that a real thing? The roosters on top of churches? I meant to look that up before we talked today.
I think I remember that from when I lived in New England. I think it is. Although I say I didn't look it up. That's just my sloppy old memory speaking.
Excuse me, I've got to go get a plug. My computer is dying.
Oh no.
Uh-oh.
It's like John Ames.
Well, I was going to say, with the building and the letter, like Greg, kind of what you said made me think, well, he's writing to preserve his legacy as a pastor in a way, right? But I keep looking at it as he's writing to parent his child after he's gone. But it's not either or, it's both. And then when we tie it back to the building and this idea of what the building represents, not only for their lives as preachers, but then their family, it's just so interconnected that I think, it's easy to follow both of those lines of thought and his motivation for writing.
Yeah, there are a number of career paths where your job becomes your identity. I think college professor is another one of those. But certainly for pastors, you can't disassociate your what you do on Sunday mornings or Monday through Friday from the rest of your life, because the ministry and the call and the life are all intertwined like that. And so, yeah, Jenny, I think you're right. Ultimately, the letter is to help parent his son, but there's also a preservation of legacy. Interestingly enough, for him, it's not the legacy of the boxes of sermons in the attic, right? That's not the legacy that he's as concerned about preserving. His wife is concerned about that legacy. That's not where he's focusing his energy and attention, which is an interesting thing. Certainly, I don't know if you all have any thoughts on that.
Well, I gave a little bit of thought to that, and in a way, as he's writing this letter to his son, I'm sure that there are ideas and things that were in his sermons. And so, in a sense, what he's writing is like his sermons from his whole life distilled and then taken further. And this also reminded me, and this is maybe kind of a tacky comment, but we have had faculty at Hastings College, not recently, but when I first got there, who had been ministers before and who came to Hastings with attics full of sermons, and who, when they died, thought, of course, that the Hastings College Library would really want all these boxes of sermons. And, of course, hymnals, thousands of hymnals. And so I was kind of reminded of that too.
Yeah, the difference now is it's all recorded electronically, but but I think there still is a sense that that's part of our legacy as pastors, right? We get up and preach 40 or 50 Sundays a week.
Right.
And, my sermons aren't as long as John Ames's are. Neither are Damon's, but 1,500 to 2,000 words every week for 40 weeks a year times 30 years. That's an awful lot of thought that goes into that, and he does reflect on that a bit. But for him, that's not actually where it's at. That's not the legacy that he's interested in passing on or carrying on.
Did anyone else notice the little life lessons that he sprinkles just constantly? Like, I think at least 3 or 4 times, this is the one thing to know. And then 10 pages later, this is it. Where it's just sort of like you're saying, like taking those gems from his sermons and then they just keep coming.
And it's this stream of consciousness thing almost, where he'll be telling a story and then he'll interrupt his own story because he has a wisdom that he wants to sprinkle, or it reminds him of another story, and then he'll circle back, and that's an interesting way to sort of get in his mind as he's writing.
Mm-hmm.
And we do kind of in this section of the book get into some more of the theological weeds, as it were. And you're talking about legacy. So poor old Boughton, however, has a son who he's named for the narrator. And the son, we kind of started to get allusions to it last time. The son was up to something, and was gone for a long time and has come back. And we get and this sort of inspires the narrator he goes on this what I felt to be quite long diatribe about the Ten Commandments, and specifically about the fifth commandment, to honor your mother and father. And we get a big discourse about, big conversation about predestination, and what that might mean. And I don't know, I was just wondering how that struck people or sat with people, those sorts of things.
I was aware that the arrival of Jack, or even knowing that he's coming back, is the one thing that really disturbs the narrator. He feels very uneasy, and it's almost like it's a flaw in him, in a way, to judge Jack the way he does. He wants not to do that, but he simply can't help it.
He
And
tries to resist.
What? Yeah.
Well, like his judgment, it takes so long. I don't know how many pages it takes to get from the first mention of Jack to why he's actually so mad at Jack. But it's a big chunk of the book, or a big
Yes.
chunk of this section of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I find it really interesting that Jack actually shows up right at the midpoint of the novel, and also, I mean, I think there's some kind of funny parallelism going on there, you know, with the narrator and with Jack Boughton, and we're told, or the narrator tells us, that Jack has this preacherly manner,
Right.
which is almost like a parody, but of course he's anything but a preacher, you know, and as we, you know, find out more about him later, we'll, you know, certainly have that held up. And the fact that Jack is named for the narrator, they're just all kinds of things going on there that I'm not sure exactly what they are, but they're interesting, and I think they're powerful.
Yeah. I kept noticing all the sort of different prodigal sons in the various characters, but particularly in Jack, the son who's gone away and not done moral things, and comes back and even calls the narrator Papa. Calls the narrator's son little brother, which the narrator resents.
Yeah, I think Jenny, I think you pointed out in our little notes that the narrator seems to sort of fear that Jack is going to try to take over his family after he dies. Did you want to say anything more about that? Or?
I think that's what I noticed a lot during this section of the book, is like he keeps like saying to his son, like, I want to warn you about this, but then I don't, you know, he's trying not to say something bad about Jack, but then he just can't help himself. And like that flaw that Constance was talking about, this judgment of Jack that he has. But with like, we get to see the narrator observing Jack with his family and how he interacts with them at the home, how he comes in and sits with them during church when he's preaching the sermon that ends up kind of then being about Jack. That he keeps saying, I wouldn't have talked about this. I wouldn't have done this sermon if I had known he was going to be there, which is really confusing until you get later on and know what Jack did. But there's, I don't know. And I don't know, it seems like he hasn't said anything to his wife about it, but she's clearly picking up on some weird vibe that's happening here, because like all of a sudden she won't look at Jack in church, and she's just being cautious about how she interacts with him. I don't know if current John Ames is feeling, letter writer John Ames, I'll just call him the letter writer, if he's feeling insecure, or if he's jealous, or if he's just mad at the fact that he knows he's dying and that, someone likely could replace him in his role with his wife and his son, whether it's Jack or somebody else.
Yeah, I feel like he is insecure about, I mean, these are people he really, really loves, just as he also loves Botten, dear old Botten. And he doesn't want them to be corrupted or taken advantage of in any way. So it becomes very personal to him. But yeah, he tries so hard not to say anything. And yet he does admit it's an omission not to have told his wife that there was somebody who is his namesake.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm imagining also that the narrator is kind of wrestling with the problem that if his wife and son become involved with Jack after the narrator is gone, that they could really have their hearts broken and their lives ruined by this man, considering what he's done in the past.
Exactly.
And so, I imagine that kind of figures into his thinking too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it strikes me that there's also a legacy component to it as well. They have the same name.
Oh yeah.
And I wonder if he doesn't fear that the narrator doesn't fear that after he's gone, folks they'll know that that this is the person who had the same name as the person who came before. It was interesting that he described. So they have this conversation about predestination, and he decides that he's going to tell his son the story of Jack's story, and he talks about sinners, and in the way that he talks about it, he describes he doesn't really have an issue with sinners so much as people who are dishonorable, and that dishonorable folks don't admit to what they've done, and they don't really seek to make amends or to correct it. And it seemed like that's what really bothers him about Jack. Maybe I spoiled too much for those who haven't read that far
Well,
yet.
and right about the place where we ended goes into, again, it's sort of like here's the one life lesson. Here's the one thing that really bothers me, but then he comes and adds another thing that really bothers him about Jack, where he says that, he's mad because Jack chose not to be a present father, whereas that's all John Ames wanted, with his first wife and child. And then now he's got that opportunity again to have the family. And he says that just that one man should lose his child and the next man should just squander his fatherhood as if it were nothing. Well, that does not mean that the second man has transgressed against the first. And then he says, I don't forgive him. I am struggling with this. It's just like, okay. So, this sort of he just keeps turning this around and around as he's writing about it.
For sure.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned that the narrator describes Jack as being preacherly, and that caught my attention while I was reading it. And so I underlined it, what he meant. What do I mean by preacherly? There's a way of being formal and deferential and at the same time cordial while maintaining an air of dignified authority, which is preacherly. Then he says that he himself has never mastered it, but Botten had it figured out.
just stumbling into it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, he was raised around it, so it seems to come naturally to him, but it's such a misrepresentation of who he is.
Oh, absolutely. Well, but the narrator was raised around it too, and
Right.
it didn't get to him. Yeah.
It struck me that sense of I seem to recall earlier in the novel him sort of describing people as sort of consciously sort of maintaining their separation from him, because they They knew that he was the preacher. And so they wanted to kind of maintain some sort of distance or separation. And that description sort of strikes me in that sort of same, there's some sort of this little slight sort of divide between the two, which I kind of thought was interesting. And he described his grandfather as being impressive in another style, not in that preacherly style.
It strikes me that this section is so much about relationships between fathers and sons, both the positive side of that and the negative side. We get a lot of revelation about strife in the family, particularly between the narrator's father and grandfather. And yet the narrator says something that I didn't notice on the first reading about it sort of this necessity to revere your father no matter what he's done. And that seems to come through. They're also sorry when the grandfather leaves at the end of his life and goes to Kansas. And then there seems to be some kind of atonement that the father and the narrator make in going to Kansas and finding the grave. But there's also mention of Cain and Abel and Abel's blood crying from the ground. Let's see, I've got a note here. Yeah, he wonders how his father could preach in a way that seems to disrespect his own father, the grandfather. Almost as if you need to sort of cover up for your parents, and yet, or your father and your grandfather, and yet he is revealing everything that his grandfather is, or pretty much everything his grandfather has done. It's sort of the tensions between the generations.
Yeah, tensions between generations, and also tensions sort of like the irresistible force meets the immovable object, with two people who have such strong senses of ethics that are diametrically opposed.
Exactly.
Well, and I think of my, anti-war generation, and our parents, be another, and of course every generation reinvents that, but yeah, you do have the strife between all kinds of different parent-children, father-son relations in there for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between grandfather Ames and, now I'm confused. Father, the grandfather, and he's the one who's pro-war, right?
Well, he's pro-war because he's so anti-slavery.
Right.
Right. That the only way to get rid of slavery is war, and so we have to have war.
Yes, and then John Ames's father is, like you were saying, Anne, like diametrically opposed, but the way we get it is through peace. I mean, we have these two very polar, opposite approaches. So, right. I mean, that it speaks to they're aiming for the same end, but their means to get there are just so different. It's very easy to see where the family would then have these conflicts and these problems within themselves.
Right.
And deep, fundamentally philosophical and theological differences, which would be hard in the context of a family of preachers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that all preached out of the same pulpit.
Right.
Sorry,
Right.
I didn't mean to interrupt, Greg. Go ahead.
No. I think about that a lot in terms of, sure, I've got political and some theological differences between myself and my dad, but they're not vast chasms apart, right? I'm not a pacifist, and my dad is not a warmonger, and that's an overstatement of grandfather Ames and father Ames, but so fundamentally different views, which obviously helps you understand the tension in that home throughout. Yeah, and how much that must have influenced John, our narrator, right? Letter writing on Ames himself, and how conflicted that must be. And now he's thinking about the legacy he's trying to pass on to his son. I mean, there's a whole lot going on there.
Well, there's a bit of a fixation too on, I noticed in this section several mentions of the grandfather and how hard his life was, and maybe that's like also how hard he lived. And this idea, I should just find it, like he's talking about, because I was still looking for the mentions of water, but I didn't see as many of them this time as last time. But he does talk about water in terms of his grandfather's struggles. And he says, the waters never parted for him, not once in his life, so far as I know. Like this idea that he just was always sort of battling against the current, I guess, is what that metaphor is going for there. But then current letter writer, narrator, John Ames, goes into also how he himself is so sorrow driven. You know, he says that one of his skills in life is weeping with people instead of like, you know, in the laughter that he mentions laughter a lot here, but it's very rarely, unless it's tied to his son, actual like from mirth. Like it's like ironic laughter and like teasing laughter. And there's this idea that he sees a lot of that, right? He sees a lot of that struggle or that disposition for sadness and sorrow maybe in his own life. There's a connection there to his grandfather that he seems to be exploring.
Yeah, that's a connection that I hadn't made between those two characters before. But yeah, the narrator talks about it. So it was always a struggle for him to celebrate with, to laugh when others laugh and to weep when others weep. It's a scriptural allusion there. And the weeping when others weep was always easier for him.
Yeah, I mean, I also, and I'm maybe bringing in people that I've known who had such a strong sense of ethics, like not as extreme as the grandfather, but these people also tend to do everything the hard way. And I have that impression of the grandfather too. Even when it really wouldn't make any difference, you know, they just can't loosen up and relax a little. I'm making that sound trivial. I don't mean to, but that's an element too.
Yeah, the grandfather seems to be able to put aside his personal relationships for his principles an awful lot. I'm thinking about when he give away, you know, things that the family wasn't through with, or, you know, leave because of a cause and leave his family to struggle. Another thought I was having as we were talking about father-son relationships was the narrator himself seems a little uncomfortable that his son draws kind of war pictures, artillery or things like that. But he doesn't want to mention that because he doesn't want his son he doesn't want to estrange himself from his son, particularly as, you know, he perceives that these are last moments with him.
Yeah, there was the and I think this might have been in the previous section, but where if you look on the corner of the paper here, he's drawn an airplane, which he calls and whatever, and he can name off the other jets and wants me to read the small print with what guns they're carrying and what bombs they drop and all that stuff. And yeah, there seems to be a discomfort with that, but not enough of a discomfort to insist that his son return the book to the man who gave it to him.
Right.
And living in that tension. And it is probably the culmination of watching his grandfather and his father struggle through these things, right?
Uh-huh.
And he doesn't want to leave that same legacy to his own son, particularly in the waning days of his life.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you mentioned the waning days of his life, and as you might, we continue to get references to that. And he's at one point he's sort of, this is just a little bit that caught my attention that I thought was funny. He decides to do some waltzing because he hears some music. He says, I plan to do all my waltzing here in the study. I have thought I might have a book ready at hand to clutch if I began to experience unusual pain, so that it would have an especial recommendation from being found in my hands. That seemed theatrical on consideration, and I might have the perverse effect of burdening the book with unpleasant associations. And then he lists some of the books that he had considered should he feel himself slipping.
Have fun.
That he would reach out. Now, if I were to do that, I'd want to have a volume of Calvin and Hobbes at the ready. I was curious what books or things you might want to have at the ready.
That is a tough question. I can't really answer the what's your favorite book question. I'm not very good at answering that.
I mean, if I'm going to channel Botton here, you may pick Calvin and Hobbes. I would pick John Calvin's Institutes.
Well, that was one of his.
Right, I know.
But volume 1 or 2. He was going to have volume 2.
Volume 2, definitely. That's where Calvin's thinking really evolved. And I can't say my favorite theologian, Barth, because he wrote 120 volumes, and so it's not easy to pick one from Barth's dogmatics out of those 120 volumes. But Calvin had kept it to just 2, so.
Well, that was decent of him. So
Does
I continue.
Know
yeah,
if
go ahead,
the book, the book that he's reading that his wife that his wife read or his wife liked and that she read, is that The Trail of the Lonesome Pine? I didn't Google. Is it real?
Oh, it is.
It
was also made into a popular movie in the early 40s.
Okay.
Yeah.
That book is really, it features interestingly here in this section because he's reading it because she read it first and liked it. I think, if I'm remembering that correctly.
Yeah, I think so.
He hadn't read it previously, but it very much mirrors their situation where the wife is younger and then there's some comment made about some younger man who comes in than the husband, like, oh, well, that would be more suitable for your age sort of thing. But then she ends up loving him anyway and for all time. And so John Ames is like, oh, this is a good book. And, it's like he's taking it as his message to himself from his wife that even when you die, I'm not going to replace you. I'm going to love you and only you.
Well, and as I and I'm not as far in my rereading as you are, but as I remember at the end of Lonesome Pine, there's also the resolution of a feud, and in a sense, there's kind of a feud among the generations, in the novel, and so there's some kind of parallel there too, I think.
We should probably start to draw our little conversation to a close, as you are sort of maybe looking forward to the last third of the book. Are there questions that are circling around for you? Are there things that you want to find out more about? Are there curiosities remaining for you?
Well, I've finished and I'm rereading but this might be a spoiler, so maybe I shouldn't ask it.
We'll all plug our ears.
Okay. No, that's all right. Jack has come back to ask, well, this is current in where we are. Jack has come back to ask, kind of to explore whether or not he could bring his common law wife and child back to Gilead. How might this be received? Am I jumping ahead?
I'm not to that part yet, but
Oh, okay.
that's okay.
But that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, he's clearly up to something, right?
Mhm.
Because he specifically engages the two preachers in a conversation about predestination and
Right.
whether someone is always doomed to their fate or not.
Mhm.
Yeah, so interesting. Other themes or things that folks are hoping to maybe get explored a little bit more.
Well, I'm continuing to look at all the different times we have baseball in the novel, and that keeps coming up. Now they mention the Yankees, and they're always going outside and playing catch and that kind of thing. But anything that keeps turning up in a novel, I think is worth thinking about. So, okay, and I guess I would add, and this is something that Dwight Marsh said to me once that I think it was kind of off the cuff, but I thought it was really brilliant. And he said that when you're reading something like something unfamiliar, the three things to notice, and of course these would all be speculation, but what repeats, what does the title mean, and who learns something? And I think those are certainly productive questions for this book.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Mhm. Any other things that we're wondering about or looking forward to?
I'm still looking for water references. I didn't see as many in this section as the first, but we'll see what the third brings. And then in this section I noticed more mentions of laughter, but not really like happy-go-lucky laughter. And so I'm wondering, as the letter and life, I'm assuming, draw closer to the end, in the end of the book, like how those things feature.
Greg?
It feels like he's trying not to repeat the mistakes of his grandfather and father, but because he swam in that water for so long, it's so deeply embedded in him that it's coming out in his writing. And so while he's trying not to pass that legacy on to his son through his writing, he ultimately is passing that. It's this notion of, I don't want to call it trauma, like generational trauma, but just the things that we learn tend to be the things that we pass on, and even if he's trying to avoid doing that, he's doing it anyway. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out as well.
Right.
Yeah. This is, I think, connected, Jenny, to sort of what you were talking about. I'm curious about how you end a letter like this. Just if you were writing a letter like this, at what point would you think, okay, I'm satisfied, I've said enough about myself, or whatever the case may be? I don't know how you wouldn't just try to keep writing, but so those are some of our thoughts, some of our reflections, some of our noticings and musings on Gilead so far, a novel by Marilynne Robinson. We do have another sort of open Zoom chat coming up next week on Thursday. Someone will tell me what date that is in a little bit, at 6:30 p.m. It's not too late for folks to sign up and join in on those, and just let the church office know, and we'll go from there. So that'll be next week, and then the week after that we'll have another one of these little podcast with video element sorts of things. So but I think it's safe to say that we are all enjoying our read through Gilead, and we hope that everyone else is enjoying their read through as well. So until next time, toodaloo.
Toodaloo.
Bye-bye.